Hi, listeners. We're happy to say there's some changes afoot here at How God Works. We're adding a YouTube site for the show where you can see clips from our interviews, access our live events, and even listen to full episodes if you like. You can find us at youtube.com/@HowGodWorksPod, all one word. And if you're not following us yet on Instagram, please do at HowGodWorksPod. Right now, we're in something of a crisis in the U.S. And I don't just mean our politics, although there's plenty to hash out in that domain. I'm thinking about what's happening to us at a deeper level. Who we are as people and as a society. Anger, loneliness, and despair continue to rise. We're not only talking past each other, we're demonizing one another. We're losing sight of the common good, and our social fabric is fraying. So while we're on hiatus for February, we thought it'd be a good idea to revisit a conversation I had with On Being host Krista Tippett and U.S. Senator Chris Murphy back in the spring of 2024 about how taking a spiritual approach might just be the way to heal a divided nation. Listening back, it feels more relevant now than ever. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. If you're a fan of Krista Tippett like me, you probably know her as the host of On Being, a podcast where she explores many of the most enduring questions about spirituality and what it means to be human. But before she earned a degree in divinity from Yale and got behind the mic, she had a different career, one that set the stage for her later interest in how people find meaning and purpose even in the most difficult of times. So I know you started your career, your professional career, as a foreign correspondent in Germany in the 1980s, even becoming an aide to the U.S. ambassador in Berlin. I'm wondering, how did you go from there, from that political arena, to kind of thinking about these deeper questions in life, the spiritual, the philosophical, and the theological?
I think I was very much a child of the mid-'60s, and I believed that politics was the realm where all the important things happened. And also the great existential civilizational threat of that time was nuclear missiles. And so I ended up kind of studying abroad and getting pulled into that and really feeling like that was the most important place I could be. And I did come in as a journalist, and then I was with the State Department. So I kept getting closer and closer to that genuine power. I was having that experience of being with people who were moving the missiles around on a map of Europe. And then I was having this experience of this very bizarre social experiment of taking one city and splitting it in two. And the people on one side had capitalism and freedom and democracy and agency and choice. And the people on the other side, who had exactly the same language and history and background, had none of those things. And yet I got really fascinated at that level by how people created lives of dignity and beauty and intimacy, or didn't do that. And it was not dependent on which side of the wall you had ended up on. And I found that question and the drama of that really, in the end, much more compelling than the quite ego-driven movement of the missiles on the map of Europe.
Is that still a part of your interest, the political enterprise? I ask that because a lot of people now, when they think about the political enterprise, are either girding for combat across ideological lines, or they're checking out because it's just too intense or too angry and they don't want to deal with it anymore.
You know, I am pretty fascinated at this stage, 40 years after those years we were just talking about. In my mind, the human drama, in fact, is what underlays and drives politics, right? And so I feel like, having decided to focus on the human condition, that's also my lens on how I analyze what's happening politically. And I think in the 20th century, we pretended that we could create these compartments of our interior life. And that included what we did with religion. You know, we decided it was private and had no public relevance and was not that serious. And in fact, a lot of the academy believed that it would just wither and die. So we put a lot of things in compartments, and it turns out that when I look now at our political life and just those dynamics you described, what I know is underneath all of our anger and our, the emotion that we have in the political sphere now is a lot of fear, a lot of pain, a lot of uncertainty, which our bodies don't do well with. So our psyche is now running the show. We make it look like anger because that feels powerful. But in fact, we're all terrified, and there's no getting away from that. There's no putting it back in a compartment.
From what you're saying, it sounds like you would agree that religion and spirituality can play a role in healing some of the societal divisions we're facing, not just fomenting them.
Yes. I mean, I would say that the voices and the messaging that have become religion in politics, to me, are quite distant from the actual spiritual or intellectual content of religion at the heart of the great traditions. So there's politicized religiosity, which is connected to also professed identities. And then you know as well as I do that fewer and fewer people are feeling connected to those identities. I think that also paradoxically, as the identities and the institutions struggle, like all of our institutions are struggling, that came out of the last century, the spiritual questions don't go away. I see them rising up more forcefully. There is a moral dimension to how we're struggling with economics and politics and life together. And these traditions and practices and rituals have always been kind of the seedbed of moral formation and moral vocabulary and moral imagination. And so even if religion is never going to come back with the strength or with the influence that it had until not very long ago, we actually have to recover that capacity for moral imagination, moral deliberation, discernment, and actually having some kind of shared moral vocabulary where we can make all the decisions that this world is asking us, calling us to make. And I think we are still going to reach back into these traditions, which have been there for thousands of years, with all of this conversation across generations, for at least some of that wisdom that we're seeking, that we need.
But it's not just a shared sense of ethics or morality that's at stake here. These traditions speak to much more.
The most elemental definition of what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual life is interior life. We do have interior lives. And this part of the human enterprise where religious traditions and spiritual traditions reside, this is the only part of the human enterprise that sends human beings inside and actually values and takes seriously what happens there. So if the institutional affiliation and identification that once was just automatic for so many people, if that just falls away, what also falls away is that whole experience of being encouraged and supported and having an inner life. And I'm not saying, like, you and I both know that the experiences people had when this was inherited were on the whole spectrum from beautiful to ugly. And probably most often, a really mixed bag, and a lot of it not very meaningful, but still there were tools there, and there was language there, and there was a place to go back to when you were in crisis. And there were some teachers, and all of that has fallen away. And of course, the existential crises, the things that people are despairing about now, are very reasonable things to despair about. We've just gone through this pandemic experience. I don't think we have even begun to metabolize like what that meant, and not just what it did to our stress response and nervous systems without release for several years, and the stress of lockdown, what that did to us. And then the ecological crisis, the racial reckoning, we have these major civilizational challenges. We're reinventing gender. Like, this is very stressful. So we could use just the innate sense of where to find some resources for working with that. And of course, there is therapy, and that's great. And therapy saved my life at one point. But what we're talking about with the depths of spiritual traditions is more than that.
Spirituality, as Krista suggests, can offer more than therapy alone. including practices that can help us find a deeper meaning and shared purpose. As we've noted on this show before, a majority of people in psychotherapy wanted to address their spiritual concerns. And that number includes many atheists and agnostics too. After all, it isn't only religious folks who are faced with figuring out what it takes to live a good life.
Spiritual life doesn't fall away in the absence of belief in God. And it was interesting in the early days of On Being, when it was called Speaking of Faith, it had this name that was kind of in your face, and we had to overcome that name. But something that was completely fascinating was how many people would write to us in the early days who were atheists and agnostics and would say, I love this show, because they also felt left out of the moral conversations. And they have moral lives.
I think this is one reason why Krista and I both host the shows we do, ones that explore morality, spirituality, and meaning. But that branding issue is a real one. It's also a challenge we face here sometimes. When people hear our title is How God Works, more than a few assume we're out to proselytize rather than explore the science behind spirituality and its links to well-being.
I think a lot of people who have raised new humans in these last decades had very understandable baggage about the religious upbringing they received, and they were free for the first time to kind of just let it go. But their children who haven't been raised in that have no baggage. And so when they come back to the quest for meaning, they are just wide open with curiosity and often end up, if not gravitating back to the institution, at least, again, that's the place in the human enterprise to look. That's where the teachers are. That's where the texts are. We have other kinds of teachers and texts now, but I think when people go deep, when the questions get theological, when they get mystical, you're going to wander through some of those doors. Even now, as I see people who have grown up with no identity, no religious formation, who then come back to what I would just say are human, is a human search. The questions that the traditions arose to address about the meaning of life. Where else do we talk about courage and hope and love? These things that give life meaning.
But for many people, there's a different kind of hesitation around religion. One that isn't so much about religious baggage as it is about what believing in God says about you as a person.
I can imagine a rational person saying, well, okay, so religion is there as a crutch in crisis or frailty. I want to say crisis and frailty and thresholds are an elemental aspect of being human across the lifespan. And paradoxically, weirdly, often our greatest chances for breakthrough as human beings, our greatest chances for learning and growth come in those moments where everything falls apart. So I want to say, again, that this is the only place in the human enterprise I can find that honors that reality with seriousness. The traditions and the spiritual experience have been symbiotic in human life and human cultures. And I think that is something to stand before with some reverence and care.
Adversity, vulnerability, weakness, these aren't signs of failure. In fact, research shows that they often lead to growth, if we approach them in the right way. And it's here that many spiritual traditions excel. They help us frame these moments, find strength within them rather than fear or shame, and reemerge stronger on the other side. But as they fall away, Krista thinks many Americans are missing the memo about the value these challenging moments can play in our lives, and that misunderstanding is at the root of a lot of our current social unease.
If you look at American culture and American political life, we really, really want to pretend like there's no frailty. Like we're not frail, nobody else is frail. We're living in such a la-la land in terms of our view of the world. There's no reality to how we analyze and these assumptions we make and this foundation on which we make laws and analyze other people. It's all abstractions. Just coming back to what you said earlier about how we fight with each other now, as though we're fighting about opinions or fighting about thoughts, beliefs. The thoughts and beliefs are a veneer over all of these emotions, and in fact, all of this personal and societal crisis.
I think your point about the widespread fragility of all of us is well taken. And I'm wondering, rather than arguing about things like poverty and healthcare and tech addiction or other things from a political standpoint, how would it change if we actually approached it through a spiritual lens, do you think?
Yeah, we would have a whole different kind of conversation and analysis. Amanda Ripley is kind of a journalist who became a conflict resolution person. And she says that there should be in journalism a fear beat or something like fear and despair beat. Because, here's an example that is very poignant and very significant in our culture. And this happens way too often. Every time there is a shooting, I just always want to, I don't have a radio anymore. It's coming on my computer, but I want to throw it against the wall. When the very serious sounding announcer says, police are still searching for a motive, or like the motive is unknown, right? This is human despair. And so they'll come up with a motive, but that's not what did it. We never really address this underlying despair. And if we wanted to go further with this kind of violence in American culture, you can even analyze it in terms of demographics and data, and you see that it has something to do with the crisis of maleness, that actually committing a public shooting like that in most cases is a form of suicide. So it is despair. It is despair. So to your question, what if we actually decided to address that in our society and uncover it and take it seriously and understand it, and then talk about what policies would be? Would be very different. Sure, we need gun laws, but that's like a Band-Aid.
What would it be like if our political leaders took this approach? Up next, we'll talk to one U.S. senator who's trying.
I think there's no way to look at what's happening in America other than to come to the conclusion that there's an unraveling happening for many Americans. And I talk about that as a spiritual crisis in the non-religious sense.
That's Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut who, like Krista, is arguing that if we want to get at the root of many of the country's most pressing issues, we need to take spiritual suffering into account.
I think a lot of Americans are having trouble connecting to purpose and meaning and connection today. And I think the sources of that are not hard to understand. I've written about, increasing sense of powerlessness that people feel. They're playing by the rules that society has set for them. They're employed. They're good citizens. They show up for work every day. Maybe they went to college or even got a graduate degree, and then they feel like they're treading water and that their kids are going to be even worse off. It's a sense of economic powerlessness. I think people are feeling lonely and disconnected. It just feels harder to find time with friends, harder to find meaningful connection. And the data tells us that we are just spending fundamentally less time with friends and family members than we used to. I think technology, once very promising, now feels like we're working for it rather than it working for us in so many ways. Technology seems to be a means for folks to control us and profit from us, driving a lot of Americans mad. And then I think there's a broad general dissatisfaction with the way that consumerism has replaced citizenship. Everything around us is a commodity today. It seems like the only thing we're really asked to be in American society today is a purchaser. And that feels really empty and soulless. So, that's my kind of beginning list. And I think it's a list that across the political spectrum, there'd be a decent amount of agreement on. That's not a terribly partisan list. Economic powerlessness, frustration with technology, loneliness, frustration with suffocating consumerism. And I talk about these things in part because I'm hopeful to build a little bit more of an apolitical, less politically toxic conversation around what is making many Americans feel less happy today than they did just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
So I want to focus on your use of the term spiritual crisis or spiritual decline. And I know you kind of mean that in a non-specifically denominational or religious sense. But I'm wondering, why did you choose that term?
What I think I have realized in traveling my state and doing a little bit of traveling around the country is that there are a number of phenomenons and transitions that have played out in American society and society writ large over the course of the last 30 years that are kind of unprecedented in scope and speed. And it has caused people very quickly to be unmoored from the ways in which they previously found identity, right? Who am I? How do I define myself? And meaning. What am I working towards every single day when I wake up? That sounds like a philosophical or religious conversation, but it's a political conversation because what business am I in? I'm in the business of trying to help people seek happiness and fulfillment and contentment. I'm not supposed to deliver the last mile. I'm supposed to deliver the first few miles. I'm supposed to set the rules of society as a United States Senator so that people have easier access to fulfillment, contentment, happiness, and less people are reporting that they feel those things. So I, as a policymaker, have to dive deep and figure out why are people feeling that way. And so what I've come to the conclusion is that the metrics that we judge our success by seem pretty disconnected from the things that are actually driving people to unhappiness today. Everybody has a job in America today. Not everybody, but if you want a job, you can basically get one. But I'm told that I judge my success by the unemployment rate. Well, unemployment's going down, unhappiness is going up. That's one example of where, I think I've got to be digging deeper. So I'm digging deeper to try to find the answer. If people are all working, if test scores are going up, if crime is going down, why are people feeling so bad? And I think that's because people are losing a sense of identity and a sense of meaning. And I think that I've got to think about doing my job in a way that gives people easier access to productive identity and fulfilling meaning. So that's why I talk this way, and that's the search that I am engaged in.
I'm wondering, as I think about American society, one of the myths we always hear or beliefs we always hear is we're here to kind of level the playing field, and then everyone can succeed if they want to put in enough effort. But I'm wondering, when you're looking for helping people find meaning, find true joy, are you suggesting that maybe the free market isn't enough and that maybe we should look to kind of older, more ancient philosophical and spiritual traditions for how to actually do that job to make life better for people?
So I think the genius of America, but also the dangerous balancing act in America from the start has been our very unique focus on individualism and entrepreneurism, juxtaposed with a concern for the common good. De Tocqueville worried about this openly. A lot of his writing is about the fact that he is kind of worried that America is going to fall apart at the seams because we are so entrepreneurial, we are so focused on individual achievement that the collective good, the common good, which is really what holds societies together and what gives you purpose and meaning, right? A sense that you are living for something other than just yourself. He really worries that America will fall apart. He identifies two things that he thinks will stitch us together. One is religious life, and the second is active participation in government, that democracy will be one of the things that we all do together. We govern together, we worship together, and that side by side with individualism will allow America to kind of be this unique combination. The problem is, we've seen in the last 20 years a rapid walk away from church and organized religion. Far fewer Americans are in those institutions. And democracy is driving people crazy. It's not giving people joy to participate in the democratic experience. It's making them feel very, very frustrated. And so I think you've got to figure out what the path forward is to create a sense of common good in America. So democracy isn't bringing people together. Church life is eroding as a mechanism to bring people together. And the market is just making things worse because 40 years ago, there were certain things in our life that weren't commercialized, that we just sort of thought existed in the common space, like healthcare. 30 years ago, insurers weren't for-profit, hospitals weren't for-profit, education was a common good, colleges weren't for-profit. But the market has made the decision over the last 30 years that everything is a commodity, that there's nothing that we jointly own, that now everything is owned by hedge funds and Wall Street and profit takers. And that, I think, siloed America, further sort of distanced us from each other. And you put that on top of the erosion of those sources of common good that de Tocqueville talked about, and people just feel very alone. So I think the question I'm asking is, what are the ways in which we are going to rebuild a connection to each other, a sense that we are all in something together? And I don't have all the answers for that, but I think that is actually one of the most important questions that policymakers can ask today.
Where are you looking for answers? Do you have your own spiritual tradition that you look to, or what philosophers and what ideas are you looking to inform those new policies?
I grew up in a congregational church. There was a unique history to my church community, a unique identity to my church community. I come from New England, in which we all felt a real kinship and still do to our local town. Often we still have town meetings. That sense of local pride, local identity is eroding in America today. As we no longer shop at the local grocery store, we order our groceries online, Amazon, when our culture is more international and national, it's flattened, it's not as localized. Our downtowns are not unique any longer, if they even exist. We all belong to the same economy. Our politics is not local any longer. Our politics are national referendums every single year because we all get our news from national outlets. Our local newspapers are drying up. So I think part of the way that we get positive identity and meaning back is localism, is setting rules at the national level that make for more healthy and unique local communities. And anti-monopoly and antitrust policy is part of that. But there are a whole host of other things that you can do to try to make local places a little bit more unique and a little bit healthier. I think that's one of the things that I hear a lot from the people I talk to when they are sort of desiring to find a more healthy identity and structure for meaning.
There's another significant change that's altered our political landscape in recent decades. While the right in the U.S. continues to embrace religion, the left increasingly avoids any language that strays from the secular realm, which effectively gives the right a monopoly on the spiritual conversation. Senator Murphy thinks that's a big mistake.
If you look at our greatest progressive leaders, they very openly talked in spiritual terms, from MLK to Robert F. Kennedy to Gandhi. I mean, these are people that are speaking in very clear and overt religious terms, spiritual terms, like really trying to connect their work to the ways in which people find purpose and meaning. There's no doubt there are very rough edges to religion. There are ways in which religion has been used to divide us, been obviously over long history of civilization, a tool and an instrument of oppression. And I do think that progressives have overreacted to the flaws of institutional religion and sort of lost that way of speaking that is still very familiar to Americans. I mean, okay, so 50% of Americans, not 70% of Americans, affiliate with a religious institution, but they all have parents or grandparents that affiliated. They still have access to that terminology. And I think it's a mistake for us to not speak in those terms. It's part of the reason why I've come back to organized church. So I grew up in a church environment. I was an active member when I was young, but like a lot of busy young adults, I walked away, and I've come back in the last 3 or 4 years, in part because I wanted to find more purposeful connection to my community, and church was a place to do that, but also because I wanted to get access to that vocabulary again, right? I wanted to be able to talk about religion, and I didn't think that I could do a very good job of that if I wasn't attending services, if not every week when I can. So I've been pretty purposeful about trying to push my colleagues reconnect with the language of religion and the language that comes with exposure to religion around purpose and meaning.
When you're on the road, be it New Haven, Waterbury, New London, or even DC, and you speak in this way, Do you sense that there's an openness to it, or are people kind of looking at you sideways like, I'm not sure about that?
Yeah, I think it's 50-50. I mean, again, our political leaders used to talk in these terms regularly 50 years ago, but it's been a long time since figures on the left have openly talked about these ideas. But the right is talking an awful lot about it. And the right has always talked in overtly religious terms, but the right is now spending more time talking about what the good life is, right? What the elements of a meaningful life are and how policy can fit a more conservative conception of that. Now, what the right tends to say is that the good life existed 50 or 60 years ago, and we have to just dial back our policies to sort of meet the 50s and 60s, and the good life will return. The left, I think, has to be more purposeful in saying, listen, there are some transitions that have happened that are not being reversed. We are not going back to a patriarchal society, but it doesn't mean we should ignore the crisis that men are feeling today. They are having a crisis of meaning and purposes. They are all of a sudden not the breadwinner, the protector of the family, when all of a sudden they rightfully share that role with their wife or their partner. And so our movement has to be about how to transition men's identity from solely that function as breadwinner or protector to something that is much more holistic and constructive and shared. But we need to talk about meaning and purpose if we want to have that conversation, because we have to acknowledge that there's a crisis amongst men today. And just ignoring it and telling them to get over it and not speaking to it, I think, is a mistake. So I think there's a lot of people on the left who feel unfamiliar with this, but I've had just as many, when I talk about the crisis of male identity today, I get just as many pats on the back from the right and the left for being somebody that's willing to speak in those terms.
So one of the wonderful things about the U.S. is that it's a pluralistic society. How do we talk about spirituality in the way that kind of we're looking to all faiths to see how to make life better?
Well, again, this is the question of belonging. What do you belong to? And I mean, the genius, the real success story of America is that we allowed you to belong to two things at once. We allowed you to belong to your community, whether you identified that community as a Protestant or a Jewish community or an Irish American community or a Haitian American community. And we allowed you to belong to this broader thing called America, which is defined by everybody being able to exist concurrently. And we protect and celebrate those siloed existences, and we're all committed to self-governance. And I think we have sort of lost that celebration of the whole. We are in the process of sort of losing a patriotism, and that patriotism has always been about celebrating the differences. We are now kind of not allowed to celebrate the differences, right? We are just supposed to fight over the differences. Obama had this great analogy in which he said, remember, we're scrimmaging against each other. We are wearing pennies, right, in these political contests, but we're actually on the same team. That was a really simple, beautiful metaphor that I think has been lost on Americans. And so part of why I'm trying to convene this conversation around frustration with technology, economic powerlessness, frustration with consumerism is because I actually think that can unite right and left and make us sort of understand that there are some fights that we are all in together. So in a pluralistic society in which we all identify on different religious grounds or different ethnic grounds, different racial grounds, these fights can unite us. And my party often talks about fights in ways that divide, right? We look at Latinos and we say, you care about immigration. We look at African Americans, you care about voting rights. No, in fact, there are lots of things that we all care about. And maybe we should spend more time talking about the set of challenges that unite identities, unite political parties as a means to try to get back to that place where we were pluralistic but patriotic all at the same time.
It's true that spirituality gives us the tools to do inner work, not just to recognize our own vulnerabilities, fears, and flaws, but to address them and emerge the better for it. But here's the thing. When you're part of a social species like humans, doing inner work ends up meaning you're doing outer work too. When we find compassion, forgiveness and love for ourselves in the face of the challenges life throws at us, it can't help but nudge us to find it for other people too. And right now, I think that's what we're missing most. The world around us feels uncertain, lonely, even hostile at times. But improving it doesn't mean going backward to the way things were in the past. Just perhaps looking backward at the wisdom produced by centuries of spiritual thought and practice. If we don't take those seriously, we're ignoring some of the best lessons our ancestors gifted us. But if we take this knowledge and adapt it to our current needs, we can find new ways to lift each other up rather than tear each other down, even when it comes to politics. This doesn't mean it'll be easy, or that everyone will agree. Life always has struggles. But every religious tradition I know of, deep down, centers on the same things: finding a way through together, reducing suffering for everyone, leaving this world a better place than where we found it. And I think that's what Krista and Senator Murphy are after, and why, in their own ways, they're advocating taking a spiritual perspective. In truth, it's why I do this podcast, and why I hope it might help you at times find your way through life too. I'll admit, none of us has all the answers. But speaking as a scientist, I know we're on the right path. Thanks for coming on the journey with me. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks.org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at howgodworkspod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.